Thank you, Alanka. Thanks, everyone, for being here. As Alanka said, my name is Paul Pasimino. My last name is from Ecuador. My father's family is all from Ecuador, so I grew up knowing about Texaco and then Chevron's environmental disaster there, and have been working with Amazon Watch since 2007 on our Clean Up Ecuador campaign. I was also a part of the group that first came up with the idea of doing Anti-Chevron Day every year. Used to be that every year at this time, Amazon Watch would accompany allies from the Ecuadorian Amazon into the Chevron shareholder meeting to confront the CEO and the board face to face, demand that they clean up the Ecuadorian Amazon, and demand that they be held accountable. And year after year, they were treated in the most disgusting, overtly racist way by Chevron's leadership, who dismissed them as people who didn't understand what was really happening, or people who were manipulated by greedy lawyers, as if they didn't know the truth of what Chevron had done to their communities deliberately, as if they didn't deserve the respect. But that's the way this company treats communities in the zones where it operates, as expendable. And that's why we stood up with groups in 2014 and said, enough of this. Before the shareholder meeting every year, we're going to have Anti-Chevron Day in solidarity with those communities around the globe who have been treated by this company this way for over 100 years. And Richmond, of course, is a perfect example of that. So starting in 2014, we had protests in 20 different countries on 5 continents, all standing up to Chevron demanding accountability. And I want to talk to you principally about the situation in Ecuador, because that's what Amazon Watch has been working on. But I also want to plug for you a report called Chevron's Global Destruction. So if you go to chevronsglobaldestruction.com, you'll see this report. It was put together a couple years ago, and it details the fact that Chevron owes over $50 billion to communities it has harmed around the globe. In some cases, it's where it has violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In some cases, it's like what it has done in Richmond or in Ecuador, but it adds up to over $50 billion. And a couple of years ago, the House Oversight Committee had a hearing and hauled in the CEOs of the major oil companies, including Mike Wirth, the CEO of Chevron. And Rashida Tlaib held this report up and said, Mike, I want to know when you're going to write the check for the $50 billion you owe to people you have harmed. And Mike Wirth sat there like, I don't know what you're talking about. What? Chevron is a great neighbor. What are you talking about? And denied knowing anything about this report. And every year at the shareholder meeting, including this year, this report is brought up to the management by shareholders, demanding that it explain why it hasn't paid and what it's going to do with the money that they own as part of the company in the liability of $50 billion. And Chevron continues to deny and try to escape justice. And really, that's why the Ecuador case is so important that everyone understand about. So I'm going to jump back, and I know I have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to try to do it in my time. Forgive me if I go over. What everyone should know is that in the 1960s, the very first oil company to drill for oil in the Amazon was Texaco. They went to the Ecuadorian Amazon in 1964. Nobody had drilled for oil there before. They found that there were reserves in the northern Ecuadorian Amazon, and they signed an agreement with the government there, a consortium agreement, and they became the sole operator. They set up the wells, they set up the system, and they were the ones who drilled for oil from 1964 to 1992. And during that time, they deliberately dumped over 60 billion gallons of toxic oil waste into the Ecuadorian Amazon, and it's still there today. They did this as a cost-saving measure. They estimated they would save $3 a barrel if they just dumped it into the rainforest and didn't re-inject it into the earth the way it was mandated in the United States and elsewhere. But the laws in Ecuador, of course, hadn't caught up with that because no one had drilled for oil before. They didn't even bother to line the pits. So they created 1,000 waste pits, and they deliberately dumped for decades toxic cancer-causing oil waste into these pits and set up a system of pipes to allow the runoff to drain into the local waterways. 5 indigenous communities lived in this area. 30,000 people were systematically poisoned over the course of decades, intentionally to save $3 a barrel. Chevron does not deny and has never denied doing this, nor doing it to save money. So it has all but admitted that it poisoned people for profit, but it has yet to pay a dime to clean up that oil waste. And so what did the Ecuadorian communities do? An alliance of campesinos and indigenous communities sued Texaco. They went to New York, they sued Texaco, they fought for 8 years in court in New York. They tried to use the system appropriately to demand and seek justice. And they were sent packing back to Ecuador after 8 years of fighting. The judge said, no, this is not the proper venue. If you want to sue, you're going to have to sue in Ecuador. At that time, Chevron acquired Texaco, and it became Chevron. So Chevron, at that point, said, you're right, we agree. In fact, we will stipulate that we will honor whatever decision the Ecuadorian courts come up with if you move this case to Ecuador. So in 2001, the Ecuadorians started all over again. Meanwhile, remember, every single day, they're still drinking contaminated water from these waste pits that are there. And for 8 more years, they sued Chevron in Ecuador. The first day of the trial, Chevron stood up and said, we don't think we should be here. This is a bogus case. They have no right to bring this. They tried to deny the very existence of the case because it's never, ever been about accepting responsibility for what they've done on the merits. They've been trying to undermine and prevent the system of justice from holding them to account since day one. But despite that, because the evidence was so overwhelming against it, it lost. In 2011, a $9.5 billion judgment was issued. Am I even close to my, oh my gosh. Okay, so and I have 2 things I need to read to you. But what's important to remember is they were held to account, and Ecuador, in the first ever case like this, indigenous community sued an oil company and won for $9.5 billion. Chevron said, we refuse to pay, we're gonna fight till hell freezes over, and then we're gonna fight it out on the ice. And since that time, they have targeted those very same people that they poisoned, called them extortionists, sued them, sued their lawyers, sued the environmental organizations that have stood up with them, and they have set a pattern for other corporations to use to target and try to destroy the people that would hold them to account. And other oil companies and corporations are following suit. This is why this case is so dangerous. It is too big to fail, because if Chevron can get away with deliberately poisoning people and then never being held to account for it and perverting the system of justice to benefit it, then what hope do we have to hold it to account for its other crimes across the globe? So there are 2 things that I want to share with you. One of the people targeted because of this retaliation was Stephen Donziger. Stephen was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. So he sent a statement that he'd like me to share with you. Stephen Donziger was one of the lawyers who helped win that $9.5 billion suit, and as a result, he was targeted by Chevron. His license was stripped. He was thrown in jail. He has been the victim of the first corporate criminal prosecution in the United States. Stephen says, to everyone in Richmond, I want to salute you for your steadfast leadership and courage in standing up to one of the world's worst corporate polluters and human rights violators. Your organizing strength in this community is seen as a pillar of power by communities all over the world who, like you, are forced by Chevron to pay an extraordinary price in lost lives, health problems, and ecological destruction due to the company's horrific and substandard operational practices. These substandard practices are part of Chevron's business model, and they permeate just about every oil installation the company owns in the world. As someone who has fought Chevron and its dozens of law firms for over 3 decades, we all know that Chevron's management counts on being able to offload its waste and cost of doing business onto the most vulnerable communities in the world. It's called greed, and it permeates the company's entire culture. Thank you for what you do here in Richmond as you fight against this polluting monster in your own community. The way you do it and your effectiveness is legendary around the world. In Ecuador, where I have worked for many years, your solidarity with the affected Amazon communities has given thousands of people and their lawyers an enormous boost in spirit and energy, which has allowed our team to power forward through the most extraordinary circumstances of retaliation. And we are with you as you attempt to deal with the destruction caused by this refinery, which Chevron operates in the middle of a major population center, knowing it spews toxic waste into the air and causes massive health problems to thousands of people. this refinery should be shut down. Chevron, as a pariah company that refuses to comply with the rule of law and operates like a criminal enterprise, should be shut down and denied a license to operate. I call on countries around the world to refuse to grant operational licenses to Chevron due to its refusal to clean up Ecuador and respond to the needs of communities where it operates. I had planned to be in Richmond today, but please understand, even though I could not make it, I'm totally with you in spirit. My connection to this community is very personal. During the 3 or so years I spent in detention in New York City at the hands of Chevron, Chevron actually persecuted me directly in the nation's first corporate prosecution. I felt tremendous solidarity from this entire community. It helped carry me and my family through a hard time, and it helped actually make us strong for the experience. I spoke at this event 2 years ago, just days after my release from detention, which is a day I will never forget. Thank you so much. I hope to see you in the next year in person. In the meantime, thank you for the solidarity and for your extraordinary leadership. Thank you. Thank you.